Now, the third presenter is Bradley MacDonald. Bradley is a pediatrician at Perth Children's Hospital and also leads the TrialR, which is a program based at the Rare Care Center. Bradley has interest in kids, interest in rare disease, and interest in rural area. You can only love the guy. Brad, please come along. Believe it or not, Bradley thinks he's a dolphin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Bradley. As they said, I'm talking a bit about rare diseases, clinical trials, and critical enablers for success in WA. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there's lots of experience, not only in rare diseases, in child health and infant health and neonate health in the room, but also in clinical trials and various other clinical trial methodology that I'm going to be talking about as well. So would be great to hear about it later on. So the Rare Care Centre I've been with for about 3 years now. And what we do in the Rare Care Centre is we look at children with rare diseases, less than 1 in 2,000, and we provide multidisciplinary care across a range of cross-sector sort of modalities for them. And we're doing very well, I think, in terms of our process, but a little bit about the rare diseases that we see. So there's more rare diseases every time I look at the number. I think it's over 8,000 different rare diseases that we count at the moment. And that's related to how we diagnose them and increasing diagnosis. Only 5% of them have a prognosis-altering treatment, and about half of them are often misdiagnosed. So they go through a very interesting therapeutic journey before being diagnosed. They see lots of people, lots of different clinicians, as you can imagine, all of the systems involved in their care. So we see them across various departments at Perth Children's Hospital. We have lots of morbidity and mortality associated with it, and it's very costly to have a rare disease. Most of them are diagnosed in childhood, increasingly antenatally and in neonates when they're born. But the time to diagnosis can take a long time as well. There is about 80% of them that are genetic in origin, and then there's, a subset of these that are undiagnosed diseases, which is also another challenge on top of this, where, you have a disease, but you don't know what is causing it. So when we've gone through this process of our multidisciplinary care for these patients, we have, listened to them to some extent, and I think that's listening to all of the consumers earlier today was very enlightening in that, and talking about this as a scientific dialogue. But our consumers were feeding back to us that essentially they did not have access to treatment, and often the only treatment that was available for them would be via a trial. So we started speaking to them, and this is where TrialR started out. But essentially, we did a bit of a straw poll of the first 100 patients that went through our multidisciplinary care centre, so the Rare Care Centre. And of those first 100 that we saw, we found that over half of them had an eligible trial somewhere in the world. So some potential therapeutic access via a trial somewhere. But does anyone want to hazard a guess at how many were actually accessing trials out of that first 100 that we saw? So we found 2 that were accessing trials. And when they're accessing trials, they're not necessarily accessing them in WA. So this is a story that we wrote up as part of TrialR for one of our patients, and the journey that they went through to access trial participation for their child. So they were going outside of WA, as you can imagine, the time, money, logistics, the time away from work, away from family, away from school, the influence on siblings that has. They were going for multiple appointments. They would have overnight stays in hospitals that are interstate, and they would have follow-up scans and questionnaires and psychological assessments as a result of this, which meant that it was multiple trips that were occurring. And they were losing the family support, their familiar surroundings, and the general feedback that we got from these patients and the clinical advisory that we had into TrialR was that we want to access these trials in WA. We want to access them closer to home. So we started thinking about how would that work? And rare disease clinical trials are different from, other clinical trials in the way that we design them and the way that they're implemented. So often we have an incomplete understanding of, the natural history of the disease. A randomized controlled clinical trial doesn't necessarily work. Often these trials, there's sometimes just like one kid in the whole state that is eligible for a trial and access. So you can imagine some of the trial design that needs to be different associated with that. There's often very sensitive, very specific outcome measures that need to be measured as follow-up for the trial. And there needs to be access to the resources required to mount the clinical trial and the follow-up required. And then, the difficulties of recruiting from such a small sample size can be challenging as well. And we like to use analogies and sort of break it down. But the one that we've been using is, Flake Mantle will be playing against Gold Coast on Saturday night at Optus Stadium, and there'll be close to 60,000 people in the stadium. And that's estimated how many kids with a rare disease there are in WA. So it's quite a few kids. So, but what we've seen from the clinical trials that have been completed in WA in rare diseases is that after the clinical trial is finished, we're knocking down the stadium. So we're building all of this infrastructure, all of these processes around this clinical trial. And then after the clinical trial is over, lots of it is lost and it's not continued on and we're not reusing it. And so we talk a lot in TrialR about what could be the critical enablers, what could we do to maintain this stadium so we could play multiple games at the stadium, right? We could reuse it over and over again. So the enablers that were sort of delineated from the TrialR process were all about collaboration, harmonisation of the regulatory pathways, clinical governance, overarching everything with institutional commitment, and this is often multiple institutions in WA Health, lots of sustainability talks and operational frameworks to continue on trial work with physical infrastructure and manufacturing capabilities, which are also being upscaled in WA. And then lots of emphasis on clinical data management systems and clinical registries. So as part of this, we are starting to build, I guess, one part of this stadium, right, with ADAPT, which is an adaptive rare disease platform trial that we're sort of conceptualizing at the moment and putting into practice, right? This would allow, say a trial where there's only one patient in the state that's eligible for that trial to have the research governance and the infrastructure available so that trial could be run successfully, efficiently, and could also make us a little bit more attractive to sort of industry partners to be like, look, WA is a great place to run clinical trials. We want to provide clinical trials for these families that want access to potential therapeutic management for their child. And in general, look, there's lots of different ways to design platform trials and designs, but really what we want is this overarching master protocol and shared platform services, including the data management, clinical trial centres, the data, the safety, the biostats associated with it. So we could feed lots of rare diseases as sort of sub-studies to this adaptive clinical trial to make it an efficient process for kids. And, a fairly sort of short talk, and I understand we're behind on time anyway, but this fits into a bigger centre of our rare care comprehensive team. So we've got these kids that are coming in for, their general sort of day-to-day paediatric care that we're helping them across NDIS funding, we're helping them with psychological safety, we're helping them with genetic counselling. And we have this multidisciplinary team and we have these patients asking again and again, and they're the ones bringing it to us. They're bringing us the trials. And they're saying, actually, I read about on this support group, I read about this, that there's access to a trial for this disease. What is happening in that area? And we feel obliged, and we need to create that capacity so we could look into these trials and we could get these trials to WA for these families because, it's not always feasible to travel interstate. You can imagine that that's not accessible to every family. And traveling internationally is also less accessible than that. So this is going to be part of our sort of research and innovation with our clinical and cross-sector services and our rare care sort of incorporation and research partners and global partners to try and increase this capability through TrialR. So now we've recognised the critical enablers. I guess we're on to the next steps of, building our stadium. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Thank you so much.